Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Truth Defender podcast. We are coming to you from the greatest country in the world, deep in the heart of the Lone Star State, Dallas, Texas. I am your host, Paul Aguilar. Really appreciate you guys stopping in. If you guys are watching us on YouTube, please go ahead and make sure y'all subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss an episode in the future. Also, hit that thumbs up button as well. That'll really help us out. But the best thing you can do is go ahead and share this episode with everybody you know. That would really, really help us out as well. If you guys are on the go, make sure you guys stop in and find us on Spotify. We're also on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, as well as iHeartRadio at Truth Defender Podcast. If you guys want to follow us on social media, you can find us on Twitter at Defender Podcast, as well as Instagram at Truth Defender Podcast, and Facebook at Truth Defender Podcast as well. If you guys have any questions or comments for myself or our guests, if you have any guest or topic recommendations, you can email us at thetruthDefender1776@gmail.com. Today's very special guest is John Potash. John Potash has been a mental health and addictions counselor for more than 25 years. He has been featured on C-SPAN's American History TV, A&E, the Reelz Channel, the Real News Network, and RT Television. He is also the author of The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, as well as Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and other activists. You can also find the film that's based on the book on Amazon Prime as well. Highly recommend that. It's a great watch. Without further ado, Mr. John Potash, how are you doing today, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me on, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually read the book twice. I actually bought that book like right when it first came out. Seen all the interviews as well. I've also watched the film, I believe, a couple weeks ago, and I watched it again like 2 days ago. So it's a great film as well. I highly recommend everybody that has no idea of actually what's going on with the government and how they influence the population as well, which is a great read. So I guess we're going to start by kind of picking through the book here and there. So I guess we can start mostly with the opium trade, right? So the opium trade has obviously been going on for hundreds of years, but most recently, you see our troops like in Afghanistan, protecting poppy fields, things like that. Pat Tillman, who I believe, who died. For those of you that don't know, Pat Tillman was, I believe, a Ranger, but he was also an NFL player prior to that. He gave it all up to serve his country, right? And I do believe
911 time.
Yeah. So I do believe that I wouldn't say it has something directly to do with all of that, but he was killed by friendly fire. What he knew, who knows? But the poppy fields, I believe, played a big part in that as well. But I guess we can start.
He was reading a lot of Noam Chomsky at the time, and he was communicating with some of these great activists like Noam Chomsky and others, and Howard Zinn. He was reading Howard Zinn and people, and he was starting to write a lot of letters home, which I think were read by the military against the war. And he was starting to, when he was first really gung ho for America and the war and their war calls because of 911, but then he started seeing what it was really going on there and changing his mind. And I think they were worried about him.
Yeah, especially if it was just some random soldier or something, maybe not so much. They wouldn't care. But if it's somebody high profile,
NFL player, like Pat Tillman, yeah.
Yeah, you can't, they don't want that kind of information out there, like regardless if it was true or not, just the fact that, he has an audience and things like that. They just don't want to have to deal with it. But I mean, yeah, I guess we can kind of start, with the opium trade and, sure, how that got started and how that got, into America.
Yeah. So the first major opium, what they called the Opium Wars, were known as the wars against China in the mid 1800s. And it was mostly the English, but some of the American families were also involved because the British East India Company had been kind of taken over parts of India and were enslaving Indians to get cheap opium. And from there, and India lied along the mountain range that went from Afghanistan to the which they call the Golden Crescent area for poppy fields, all the way down to the Golden Triangle for poppy fields, or actually up to the Golden Triangle for poppy fields, which was right near Vietnam.
Right.
And so it also came real close to where China was, and so there were some great opium fields, great poppy fields on there to produce opium and heroin. But at that time, in the mid 1800s, China was seeing what it was doing to their population. They had a huge amount of their population that got addicted to opium, and so they started to ban opium sales. And the English fought a war to force them to keep accepting opium sales into their country. And because the British was superior with their industrial revolution, having some superior ships, they won those wars and really took over China. And from thereafter, and really kind of split China up to be kind of exploited by many European countries, along with the top oligarchical American families, the wealthiest American families. And those wealthiest American families happen to, use that money to start our top Ivy League colleges. They say, for example, the Low Library is the top administrative building that started in Columbia University, and that Lowe's were opium traffickers. The Yale had top opium traffickers in amongst the Russell family. They were actually some of the biggest opium trading families. The Pierponts, which were intermarried with the Russells, was the original family of John Pierpont Morgan. Who's now got the largest bank in the world. J.P. Morgan Chase is the largest bank in the world, which is co-owned, of course, by the Rockefellers. And you can look at every Ivy League school and see the same thing going on with that. It was the Cabots at Harvard and the Greens at Princeton, et cetera. So, that was the original Opium War. But it's no coincidence, I don't believe, of course, that the two longest wars in American history were first in Vietnam and then in Afghanistan. The locations for, as I said, the Golden Triangle for poppy fields and the Golden Crescent for poppy fields, the two best places to grow, heroin and opium. Opium and heroin.
Right. So, I've kind of held this thought for a long time that I believe Vietnam, obviously there was nothing there. We were just there just because of the opium. Do you believe that also? Do you have some kind of belief of, about that, that we were just only there just, so we can get all the opium and stuff like that?
Well, they pretend that it was all to fight communism, but I think it was more of a resource war, like you say. Yeah, I think it was mostly for the poppy fields, for the opium crops. Now, Afghanistan, it's probably several things. It's probably the poppy fields and the opium and the heroin, plus pipelines and different other resources. But I think definitely a major profit motive was the poppy fields, and for profits and for social control. Because when they get the opium and the heroin into our country and into the European countries, and really get them in the inner cities and get them in different populations where they target, it really subdues that target population, because one addict creates chaos amongst a family and even a community. And when you have many addicts, which we have now, it creates chaos in many communities in the United States, and keeps people worrying about that more than worrying about the fact that the wealthiest can continue to steal our money and can get more and more power for themselves from us.
Yeah, absolutely. So World War II ends, everybody comes home, and then you had the creation of the FBI and CIA, things like that. How big a part of that comes from, those wealthiest families where, they actually put up the money for all that to happen?
Yeah, so the sources for the start of the CIA, the CIA started with the National Security Act of 1947. And the highest level whistleblower from the CIA was a man named Victor Marchetti. And he wrote a book called The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, he fought in court again and again over getting that book out. And it was still very censored, but it still came out with a lot of information. And him and a British magazine editor named Francis Stoner Saunders came out with The Cultural Cold War, also studying the CIA's history. And they both basically said that the wealthiest families in the country, who happened to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, started the CIA and put their own family members at the top of U.S. intelligence. And the National Security Act of 47 said that the CIA director supervised all the other 14 plus U.S. intelligence agency directors. So it made them basically the titular head of all of U.S. intelligence, which is vastly powerful, and continue to grow from 47 on to today. But that, it also made them, many researchers show that it made them above the law, because they could go beyond the law to do things for what they called national security reasons. And we know there's been a lot of whistleblowers, and I have them in my book, and they basically talk about how these wealthiest families that really profited at first from a lot of opium trafficking, then went on to dominate the banks, like J.P. Morgan Chase being the top bank, dominate the oil business with Rockefeller and Standard Oil, and dominate a lot of other areas of our society. And basically it was about 1917, it was noted in the congressional record that the J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller interests bought virtually all the major newspapers. So you got all the top newspapers in the country, the top cities, and bought many of the major magazines. And when you look at people like University of California, Berkeley School of Journalism director, Ben Bagdikian, he says that basically 6 multinational corporations control 95% of our information. And so that's the way they control our minds, our hearts and minds. But they particularly worry about musicians getting to our hearts and minds and changing our hearts and minds the way they want us to think. And that's why I focus on these musicians too, along with the other activists in the book and film.
Right. I mean, is that why we see things like Kanye having a mental breakdown? Supposedly, you have like Britney Spears, and I forgot that other girl's name. But I mean, like, like all these
Lady Gaga.
Yeah, like that. I mean, they're seemingly fine before, right? And then all of a sudden they have some kind of breakdown, and they start cutting their hair, and they start acting crazy, and it's I mean.
Well, I believe that was part of what program they started in 1953. And so, yeah, my book by the second and third chapter starts to get into what I talk about the most in terms of the CIA Project MKUltra. It was an umbrella project for 149 sub-projects. And, the documents from that Project MKUltra say the use of drugs as unconventional warfare. And people usually think of warfare as in the battlefields, like, you've been involved, and I understand you were a soldier yourself. Is that right, Paul?
I was in the Navy, yeah.
In the Navy, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so you think of warfare as either, off the coast of some foreign, land we're fighting, or on the battlefield of Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam. But their warfare, all the evidence turns out, was against anyone who dissented against the war, or anyone who fought for civil rights for people of color. And when activists, broke into an FBI office in 1971, that's what they found. They found the counterintelligence program papers of the FBI, which worked hand in hand with Project MKUltra, because the CIA had also a project named Chaos, but MKUltra and Chaos both worked with the FBI, because the FBI was under the CIA, and the co-intelligence program followed through with some of the goals, the racist goals of Project MKUltra, and helped with the use of drugs as weapons against all dissidents. And so now part of that was they used a lot of different drugs. I was talking about opium. Of course, they used heroin. They also used cocaine. But one of the surprising drugs I came across that they used apparently the most was LSD. And LSD was the kind of drug that could, even though all these other drugs can really hurt people's lives with the addiction, the way LSD hurt people's minds and allowed for the manipulation of people when it hurt their minds was particularly powerful for U.S. intelligence, because they didn't want people to know how much, how obvious it was that their minds were getting manipulated. And so what they found that's what they could do with LSD. So a really good writer just came out with a book, for example, called Chaos, about the Manson family. And he found that Dr. Jolly West was a CIA doctor that the Manson family was visiting at least weekly, if not daily, for about a year up in San Francisco area. And they used LSD and hypnosis to turn these kind of kidnapped, these girls that were raped and as minors, and their heads were messed with all kinds of drugs, and they were hypnotized to turn them into murdering monsters. And that's what happened. But they could also manipulate people, such as people like, as you said, Britney Spears appeared to possibly be a victim of them. But I don't talk about her, of course. I do talk about Courtney Love, and because her life kind of mirrored two women that testified at a presidential commission hearings on these kinds of projects in the 1990s. President Clinton's Undersecretary of Health, I believe it was, Donna Shalala, I think her name was, held some hearings about these kinds of experiments. And two women testified with their therapists about what the torture they went through as little kids. And as a therapist myself, I know and have been taught that between the ages of 3 and 8 years old, our minds are extremely vulnerable. So when we go through major trauma repeatedly, it can get to the point of us being in such pain that our mind splits. That's where they get what's called split personality. Now, it used to be called split personality or multiple personality in the psychiatric, Bible, the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual 4 is what it's called now. Actually, we're at 5 now, DSM-5. But they changed the name maybe 5 or 10 years ago to dissociative disorder, they call it now. And when you have split personality, it's dissociative identity disorder. With dissociative disorder, it's a little milder and you just lose track of time. And but with full-fledged dissociative identity disorder, your mind splits and you get into split personality. You've probably heard the classic cases like Sybil and people like that. But it turns out that this CIA with Project MKUltra could do that, and the best evidence is that they likely did that with Courtney Love. But that's just one chapter of the book. Of course, most of the book talks about the way that undercover agents manipulated our rock stars and the rap stars to and it could have been done with Kanye West. I believe it probably was with either with ecstasy or acid or LSD. Ecstasy's MDMA, which was also used by Project MKUltra. But starting in the 60s, they had the assistant director of MKUltra was a man named Robert Lashbrook, and Ernest Hemingway's editor A.E. Hotchner wrote a book about the Rolling Stones in the 60s. And in that book, Hotchner said that Robert Lashbrook brought loads of agents, loads of money, and loads of LSD to England in early 1965, and pushed it and ordered his agents to get in as many musicians' hands as possible. Right. Now, a few months later, George Harrison's dentist invited George Harrison, his girlfriend Patty Boyd, John Lennon, Cynthia Lennon over for dinner, and he was with his some Playboy playmate girlfriend of his, this dentist, and the dentist had them over dinner and then said, you gotta stay for some coffee. And then John Lennon and George Harrison said, no, we have to leave. We're seeing a friend's band. He said, you have to stay for the coffee. It's great coffee. So they stayed a few minutes, a little more, had some coffee, and they were dosed with LSD. And George Harrison and John Lennon was furious. And George Harrison said, what's LSD? He didn't even know what it was at that time because it wasn't as popular in England like it was in America. And so at that point, they didn't try it again for months because they were just upset about it all. But later, when it became so popular in the U.S. and they pushed it like crazy in England, people convinced them to try it a second time. a lot of other musicians did that I believe were, working for U.S. intelligence because of their intelligence connections. And I show the evidence of that in the book. But so then they all did it, but then they were manipulated to popularize it. And this is just an example because this happened with a number of musicians. Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones, for example, held out from trying LSD, acid, until 1967. In 1967, an undercover agent named Rob Schneiderman, he went by different names actually, but that was one of them. He also went by Jove. But anyway, it came out in a daily, English newspaper that he was working for both FBI and MI5 when he was known as, at the time when he was known as the Acid King in England because he distributed so much acid. And he convinced Mick Jagger to try acid for the first time. And after he did that, the police came in and arrested Jagger, and Keith Richards just popularized in the press so that they were taking acid to try to get everyone, more people taking acid. And that's the way they found they could manipulate a lot of people's minds. Is the more acid people took, the more the more it hurt their minds, just in a mild way, but the more it could manipulate them too. And they, of course, it would sidetrack many from their good anti-war activist work, and it would also sidetrack people from their good civil rights work.
Didn't they actually have like dosing parties also, like where they, like a lot of people had no idea what was going on and they were just dosing everybody there?
Acid test, yeah.
Acid test, yeah.
Yeah, and so that was so on the East Coast. Well, in 1961, there was a group. There's a CIA Project M-Culture Front group that they called the Human Ecology Fund, and this came out in the top anthropological journal. Later, just exposing all of this, in the I think it was the late 70s, early 80s, and only came out because of the Senate Church Committee, investigated after those activists had broken into the FBI office and found all those FBI papers and spread it to all the media and sent it to, around to activists and all that. But so the Senate Church Committee came out, with what found that what the CIA was doing with this dosing of people and pushing acid. And so it turns out they had this Human Ecology Fund, and this Human Ecology Fund, the CIA front company, gave money to about 45 colleges around the country, about 50 or so prisons, and about 50 or so hospitals around the country. And they experimented with acid on different people. Timothy Leary was one of the most famous of the professors that did some of these experiments, but it was also done at Stanford. And so with Timothy Leary, when he was doing it, he was experimenting first with mushrooms, and then some British intelligence agent influenced him to start using acid. And then he was kicked out of Harvard 2 years later because they were pushing so much acid and so much was going on there. And in comes to his life comes a extremely wealthy family, the Mellon Hitchcocks, William, and I forget his sister's name right off the top of my head, but Peggy Mellon Hitchcock is her name was. Now, the Mellon Hitchcocks were high up in U.S. intelligence, plus they owned Gulf Oil and Mellon Bank. So they're extremely wealthy, extremely involved with U.S. intelligence, and they go and fund Timothy Leary's group to have a psychedelic association, and they had headquarters in this area of New York, where William Mellon Hitchcock basically gave Timothy Leary for pennies his estate, Millbrook Estate, an hour north of New York City. But they also had headquarters in the West Coast, they had headquarters in other cities, and they had headquarters even in Mexico, pushing acid, as a spiritual sacrament of some sort. And so yes, Timothy Leary would have parties and invite tons of people up to from New York City, and I argue they were activists that were involved in the civil rights movement up to New York City. Right at the time, around the time of the Freedom Summer, freedom riders going down to the South to register, people to vote, register blacks to vote in the South. So they're really trying to disrupt the Freedom Summer campaign of Martin Luther King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and all that. John Lewis was one of the heads of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was the congressman who just died recently. anyway, so they were trying to interrupt that there on the West Coast. They were doing the same thing at when a Stanford hospital, associated with Stanford University, basically offered a lot of money to Ken Kesey, a guy who was in writing grad school and just trying to make a little money on the side. They offered him $150 to try LSD, and I argue that they then manipulated him thereafter. They gave him a job at the same hospital as a janitor, gave him the keys to the acid supply, and he takes the acid supply out and keeps stealing it for parties at his house. Jeez. Now, first he was telling people about the acid that he was giving them at the party, but later he had what was called acid tests, which is where people didn't know that there was huge vats of Kool-Aid filled with acid, and people were tripping involuntarily and not knowing what was going on. And it just so happens that Ken Kesey was influenced by a number of supposedly former soldiers who got him to be part of a psychedelic bus ride. That bus trip left right when a number of Freedom Summer buses left from the New York area and left from Berkeley, California, from University of California, Berkeley. They actually left about, I think, the day after the Berkeley bus left for the Freedom Summer, campaign. And they headed in the same direction. They headed down south. They were supposed to be heading to New York for a gathering, like some kind of book gathering for Ken Kesey's next book. But instead, they headed through all the South, where the civil rights demonstrations were going on. And they headed to integrated pools, and they tried getting a number of blacks tripping, and a number of activists tripping, white activists that were coming from the north to the south tripping. And so it was a counter. I argue that was a total counter to the civil rights movement, trying to hurt their minds and not have them do their best activism. And so this continued, of course, later into the later 60s, where when they started having those parties, as they called them, acid test parties, they would have a band that called themselves the Warlocks then, starting in about 63, but they changed their name to the Grateful Dead. Right. And there's tons, the Kool-Aid spiked with LSD. Some people knew it was spiked with LSD, other people didn't. People were tripping involuntarily. And they held a big acid test right after the Watts riots in Los Angeles. They said that they could still smell some of the fumes, or the smoke fumes from the Watts riots when places that were burning. And they were getting all these people, black activists there to trip involuntarily, a lot of them. And so then after that, they turned those acid tests into be-ins. So they had hundreds, and then maybe 1,000 or two at the acid tests. And then at the be-in, they had 10,000 people all tripping, up a storm. They were promoting, taking acid. And then the be-ins turned into these huge music fests where they just got tons of people. They pushed acid like crazy at the big music fests. Now, I love music fests, of course, and I love music, but it's just too bad that so many people were influenced to take acid at a number of these big, music fests out west at that time. And the Grateful Dead was really pushing it, the acid like crazy. And so were, a number of other bands were, sadly enough. I don't know if they were manipulated to do that, or, how many were manipulated, how many were paid to do that, but it was happening like crazy. Now with, Jimi Hendrix and John Lennon, I argue they were targeted and for their leftist views. They were both very anti-war, and so they were manipulated and targeted. And then when they started sobering up, like Jimi Hendrix, when he started sobering up, now with Jimi Hendrix was a special case because they inserted a former MI6 agent as his manager, because he got so big in England. He didn't get big in the United States first, probably because of all the racism. Right. But in England, he got really big really fast because he was, obviously a brilliant guitarist. And so he couldn't handle all the fame and the concert booking so easily. So in comes this guy who even, admitted he was a former MI6 agent. And all the best evidence shows he continued to be MI6. And that guy controlled Jimi Hendrix's life. Now, Jimi Hendrix got huge because of his incredible talent, but that guy tried to hurt his career And Jimi Hendrix kept trying to fire him, but he couldn't because of all kinds of financial wheeling dealings. And then 48 hours after Jimi Hendrix finally fired him, Jimi Hendrix was dead. And I got two people that have said that when he was drunk, that Donald Jeffrey, his manager, admitted having Jimi Hendrix killed. Best evidence again, which I don't have time to completely elaborate here, were though that U.S. intelligence first manipulated Jimi Hendrix to promote some drugs, but once Jimi Hendrix started sobering up, and all the evidence shows he was sobering up, they had him killed, and he was getting very activist at the end of his life, organizing anti-war, activities, promoting the Black Panthers in his last year, dedicating his last album to the Black Panthers, etc. So that's some of what they were doing.
Right. And so you mentioned the Black Panthers. Now, obviously, Tupac was kind of being groomed to, maybe be the next leader of them. Obviously, he didn't make it, but what were kind of the things that were happening, like in the background, as far as them trying to take them down?
So with the Panthers, we know what we know about the Panthers because of that break into the FBI office. Now, granted, all those FBI documents showed, that over 95% of these documents involved the targeting of leftist activists, either the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, Black Power movement, the anti-war movement, etc. But they most brutally targeted the Black Panthers. And so Tupac's mother was Afeni Shakur, and she had married Lumumba Shakur, who had started the Harlem Black Panthers. Lumumba's childhood friend, Sekou Odinga, had started the Bronx Black Panthers with Lumumba's brother, Zaid Shakur. And so the Shakurs were a great activist family. Their father, Baba, his name was Saidin Abba Shakur, his name was, had been a close confidant of Malcolm X's and was highly respected. And so they, what they did with them is they basically psychologically profiled Huey Newton, who was the co-founder of the National Black Panthers with Bobby Seale. And they figured out that he could be susceptible to, cocaine. And they got an undercover agent. And the best evidence is that Elaine Brown was that undercover agent that they got into his life. And Geronimo Pratt, the Los Angeles Black Panther leader, said that Huey Newton told him, and they both happened to be in prison together, that Elaine Brown constantly brought beautiful women and cocaine to him all the time when he first came out of jail after a frame up, and got him using cocaine regularly. And so he did develop a bit of a problem. But I believe so. Now towards the end of so that really that plus many undercover agents plus terrible police brutality plus raids of Black Panther offices all undid the great work that the Black Panthers were doing. The Black Panthers were considered some of the best community organizers in the country, and I studied community organizing in grad school and did a little bit of work in community organizing, and just really do believe that they were the top community organizing group in the country. The American Indian movement said they modeled themselves after the Black Panthers. The Young Lords, the great Latino activist group, modeled themselves, followed the Black Panthers. So the head of the Young Lords, Jose Cha-Cha Jimenez, followed around Bobby Seale for a month to learn how he did everything he did, and then copied that for the Young Lords, setting up some similar programs. And so they did great activism too, both in Chicago and New York City and many other cities. And so they were doing great work. And for that great work, sadly enough, they were targeted by U.S. intelligence, and the racist U.S. intelligence for the racist oligarchs in our country. And so Tupac grew up in that kind of family, though. When they tried to frame the New York Black Panthers, Afeni Shakur was brilliant, and she defended herself in court and was credited with getting all of the New York Black Panther 21 off in court, even though they had professional lawyers. She did an amazing job. And then she gave birth to Tupac in 1971, right after about a few months, maybe a month or two after she got out of jail. And Tupac grew up though with Afeni and with now Lumumba, and Afeni divorced after she had a fling when she was let out on bail. But he had an adopted brother named Mutulu Shakur, and Afeni ended up coupling with, and partnering with Mutulu Shakur. And Mutulu Shakur was an amazing man. He studied acupuncture in Canada and brought it down to the Bronx to help the terrible heroin problem there. And he really pioneered, the use of acupuncture for heroin, addiction in our country, starting at Lincoln Detox in the Bronx. And it was using, anyway, so he did amazing work there before the city closed him down for his success, sadly enough. He killed both his clinic director, a psychiatrist named Taft, and his lawyer, the lawyer for the clinic named Cohn, who actually also represented Asaj Shakur, Tupac's aunt. But so Tupac grew up around that and grew up incredibly political. When a preacher asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, he said a revolutionary when he was only 12 years old or so. And so Tupac then, by the age of 17 years old, was elected the youngest chairman of the New African Panthers. And that was the young adult group within a new group called the New African People's Organization that was made up of former Black Panthers and former members of the Republic of New Africa, which was another group similar to the Panthers, just doing work with slightly different strategies. And Mutulu was a co-founding member of that group. And so Tupac was already a national Black leader because they were active in 8 to 10 cities around the country, the New African Panthers, before he became a rapper. All right. And once he broke into rap, first touring with Digital Underground, and then when he got that solo, debut with Interscope, an upstart major record, label deal, he started getting wealth and fame to that activism, and that made him much more dangerous. So within a day or two of the release of his first MTV worldwide release single, Trapped, which was a political song on a political album, Tupacalypse Now was a very political album, police pretended to arrest Tupac for jaywalking, and they proceeded to choke him unconscious and bang his head against the curb. And I show, several other cases in the news where people died in police custody through those tactics. Of course, we saw it with George Floyd, but it has happened many times over the decades, obviously. So I believe that was, an attempt to hurt, maim, if not kill him, Tupac, at that time. Now, after that, you had another, attempt on his life with the situation with the Marin City Fest, where strangers punched Tupac for no reason when he was performing, right before he was to perform at this 50th anniversary Marin City Festival. And then they shot at him for no reason. And Tupac's bodyguard was Mutulu's son, Mopreme Shakur, who was Tupac's stepbrother, Maurice Mopreme Shakur. And he just shot in the air to try to scare these people away, but they shot at them, and right in front of police at the festival. And police did nothing to stop it, and they did nothing to arrest the guys trying to shoot Tupac. And they ran, so Tupac and Mopreme ran from the group and just crawled under a car. And that's the only thing that saved them, is police arrested them because this group had incited a mob to try to beat up Tupac and Mopreme for no reason. And but they saved themselves when the police car started getting messed up. And so that was another attempt on Tupac's life. There was a third one that I'm not going to go into at length, but fourth one was a situation in Atlanta where 2 allegedly off-duty police officers were out with their wives, and these brothers named the Whitwells in Atlanta. Tupac had just performed a concert in Atlanta, and he was traveling in 2 or 3 cars out away from the concert. And he comes upon a police beating on a black man in front of him. And he said, he rolls down his window and says, "What's going on?" And this is by all witness accounts. And these 2 white guys in street clothes who were beating this black man run to his window, smash the window with the butt of their gun, and shoot at him. He rolls out the back of the car where he was sitting and grabs a security guard's gun behind them, because all the guards behind him, the other cars, there's actually maybe 3 or 4 cars, got out of their cars really quickly to protect him. And so the police started running with their gun pointing back at him. And so he just shot them in the butt and the legs, in self-defense. He got down on one knee and shot them in the butt and legs. And so it was really in self-defense. And so it went to, it started to go to court, but it was all dropped. And the reason I argue it was dropped is because it was another murder attempt by police intelligence of Tupac. But it's incredible that a black man shoots 2 police officers in the South and doesn't go through court. And now it turns out that their gun they used for that was a gun stolen from an evidence locker, and it was an unmarked gun, and it was what they call a throwaway gun, so that you can just make an illegal shoot, have an illegal murder, put it down, and it can't be traced back to you. And so that and much more evidence points to the fact that this was murder attempt, number 3 or 4 of Tupac. And so these are the kinds of incidents in Tupac's life that eventually led to his assassination by U.S. intelligence. But then they framed him up with the woman. I've got probably 70% of the court documents from that trial, and from the lawyers, and it's just incredible. She admits kissing his penis on a dance floor when witnesses said it was actually a blowjob on a dance floor. They have consensual sex at night. She leaves messages. I like the way you fuck. I don't know if we're allowed to cuss it.
Yeah, gotta go.
So police get those voicemails on the hotel answering machine, and they proceed to pretend they accidentally erased them. Okay. And and then he's accused of all kinds of things in court, but accused of assisting group sex and all this other stuff, whatever. But he was only charged with sodomy, forced sodomy, attempted sodomy, assisting sodomy, gun possession, etc. All these major charges were brought against him, and in the end, he got found not guilty of everything except touching her butt against her will. And this is after they both said that oral sex happened, so it was considered consensual. But so he got found not guilty of that. But touching a woman's butt after it was found that they had consensual oral sex against their will, and that's what they end up giving 1.5 to 4.5 years in jail for that. It's pretty incredible. But just before the verdict came out, the trial was considered a failing trial for the prosecution. They thought they were going to lose it completely and get no charges to be found guilty. He was going to be found guilty of whatsoever. And so they actually offered to make it a mistrial based on evidence they held back, but Tupac wouldn't accept the mistrial. So the night before the verdict, Tupac was asked to, he was out on bail and was being asked to record something at the Quad, studio in Times Square, right near Times Square. And he's, some random muggers come in, shoot him and put him down the ground, then shoot 2 bullets in the back of his head. And the doctor's affidavit said it went through the back of his skull, came out the front of his skull, and he miraculously survived. But, that was assassination attempt number 4 or 5, as I say. And he's very lucky he survived that. The security guard offered the surveillance video of these, shooters to police, and the police turned it down and said they closed the case. And these muggers, so one of the shooters said, I was actually paid by Jimmy Henchman Rosemont to carry this out. And Rosemont, I have a government document that said he had already signed with the government to be an informant for the government before this incident. So it's just, and he was a drug dealer. He was actually later in prison for drug dealing. So there's just a whole lot to all this. But Tupac was he was actually only pretending to be a gangster to appeal to gangs and politicize them. And in doing that, he was a major target of the CIA and the FBI because he was leading gangs around the country to call peace truces and turn on to activism and to stop drug dealing. Massive gangs around the country were cutting down on or completely stopping their drug dealing. And that took huge amounts of money out of the CIA drug traffickers' pockets, plus huge amounts of money out of the banks. And that's why they finally did him in.
Yeah, it's a big no-no. Don't be messing with people's money like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess real quick, where does Suge Knight kind of fit into all this? He's a real piece of shit too, but
yeah. Well, Suge Knight was low man on the totem pole, but the real higher man on the totem pole was his Dave Kenner, his lawyer, because Dave Kenner incorporated Godfather Records to be the umbrella company above Death Row Records. Okay. And Dave Kenner founded Death Row Records for Michael Harry O'Harris, who was one of the two assistants to Freeway Ricky Ross. Now, Gary Webb exposed how Freeway Ricky Ross was getting cheap cocaine through CIA assets, through the CIA Sandinistas who were fighting the socialist Nicaraguan, government. Basically, they were the Contras. It was part of the Iran-Contra crack, scandal. So these different CIA assets, who Gary Webb says was basically the Contras were a CIA-funded army, pretty much, just trying to topple the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And that was anyway. So Freeway Ricky Ross gets all this free cheap cocaine turned to crack. And one of his two right-hand men is Michael Harry O'Harris. He starts Death Row Records with Dave Kenner. Then he goes to jail, and Kenner runs it has Suge Knight run it. Now, Suge Knight had increasingly serious charges against him with increasing penalties until there was a point in maybe 1990 or 91 where he doesn't get any more penalties for serious charges. And that's the time it's believed that he became an undercover agent for this program to start Death Row Records in order to traffic drugs, which it did, which Russell Poole, a high-level police officer who investigated Death Row Records, found they were drug trafficking, they were gun running, they were trying to end the Bloods, Crips versus Peace truce Bloods versus Crips peace truce, which Tupac and his Black Panther extended family had started and was spreading around the country. And they were trying to lure Tupac onto the label to manipulate him. And then when he vowed to get off their label, when he said, "I'm done, I've fulfilled my contract," they did him in. They helped do him in.
Yeah, I guess it's a recurring theme. When these guys are trying to get clean, or they're trying to go straight. Just they have no use for you anymore, and they can't let you be walking around with all that information, knowing what you know, so they just have to get rid of you. I mean,
yeah, with Tupac, he was just too serious of an activist. He was, and he was, he was getting clean and sober. I mean, Russell Simmons said at a party that everybody was drinking and smoking weed, and Tupac wouldn't touch anything. He was just dancing all night, and he had vowed to. He got engaged to his, fiancee Kadada Jones, Quincy Jones's daughter. They were planning to have a family. He'd already fired Dave Kenner as his lawyer 9 days before he was killed, and that's like a similarity to Jimi Hendrix. Like 9 days after firing his U.S. intelligence-linked, manipulator, they're killed. Really soon after they're killed, and but Tupac was a lifelong activist, an incredible activist, and he was only pretending to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. That's why he might be, he's more misunderstood for that, the way he put on that gangster persona for that reason. Right. Because he was really an intellectual prodigy, brilliant guy.
Yeah, that's sad. I mean, they kind of stopped that before, he can do any kind of damage against them, I guess. But yeah, it's really sad. I mean, well, sir, I mean, as we come to the end of our time here, I don't want to keep it too long here on a Saturday afternoon. It's some great weather outside, so hopefully we can all get outside this weekend. But yeah, I mean, I guess, can you please just let everybody know where they can find your work, sure, on Twitter, things like that?
Sure. So yeah, my book and film, and the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders book and film can both be found on johnpotash.com, or you can look up, it's easier, FBIWarOnTupac.com or drugsasweapons.com. The website's got 3 names.
Right.
Any of those 3 names. But it's also available on Amazon. They're all available on Amazon. You can actually order them. You should be able to order the Drugs as Weapons book or film at Barnes and Noble. I'm not sure that's still they're still available there, but they have been for years. If people want a signed copy, I'd be happy to do that for anyone. But hopefully they are also at some independent bookstores around the country.
Awesome. Is there any plans in the works for a new book or something out there? Hopefully in the near future.
I'm working on several new projects, projects, and one is with about Tupac and his mother, Afeni Shakur's trial, a famous trial in New York, as I mentioned earlier, ending with more on Tupac. And I also got a new book and film that I'm working on too, which is it's a little bit overlapping, but it's more humorous too. And if I can make any of this humorous, but going from eugenics to what I think is the current pandemic, just my view of things, but based on lots and lots of research.
Right.
So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely be looking out for those. Hopefully we can get you back when you get those out to everybody as well. So everybody, like you said before, you can find them on Facebook at John Potash. The website is johnpotash.com. Instagram is at drugs as weapons.
No, I don't do. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not anymore.
I don't have time for any of the other social media. The Facebook,
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, no, it can be a lot. There's a lot of different ones, and everyone's trying to reach out, and it gets crazy after a while. Mr. Potash, I really appreciate your time. Hopefully you have a great weekend and continued success. I enjoyed the book as well as the movies, so I highly recommend anybody that hasn't seen them already to please get them as well. Quick thing before we go, everybody, for all you guys, I just want to give a shout out to everybody that's listening to us out in Australia, Italy, the UK, Ireland, South Africa, Netherlands, Norway, we're out there in Norway, Brazil, and the Faroe Islands. I have no idea where that's at, but I have heard of you guys, and I appreciate you guys for stopping and listening to the show as well. Para toda mi gente que nos están escuchando en España y todos que nos están escuchando en Colombia también, les mando un saludo grande. Muchas gracias a todos. Once again, everybody, if you guys are going to catch us on the go, you can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio as well. Twitter at Defender Podcast, Instagram at Truth Defender Podcast as well. And like I mentioned before, if you guys have any questions or comments for myself or our guests or topic recommendations, you can email us at thetruthDefender1776@gmail.com. I really appreciate you guys stopping in for this episode. We'll be back again next weekend with another one. And until then, I hope you guys have a great weekend and stay safe out there. Stay blessed and stay frosty. Thank you, sir. Have a great one.
You too. Bye now.
Bye-bye.